settle in, turn down the lights, and if you'd like to hear more true horror every week, tap the like button and leave a comment. Now, let's begin. I hadn't been back to McDowell County in over 30 years. After the mine shut down and my brother died in the collapse, I swore I'd never step foot near those hills again. But when my mother passed last winter and the old family home became mine, I didn't have much of a choice. Selling it meant returning to where everything started and ended. The drive through the Appalachian backroads felt like going backward in time. The small towns were mostly gone now. Boarded up shops, rusted trucks left in tall grass, old church signs with missing letters. The air smelled the same though. Coal dust and pine, damp earth, that cold metallic edge that never left your tongue. The house was exactly how I remembered. Sagging porch, flaking white paint, and the mountains looming right behind it. I spent the first few days cleaning, fixing pipes, sorting through old things. Mom had kept every newspaper clipping about the mine accident, like she couldn't stop herself from reliving it. I found one with my brother's name printed in bold. Local miner among 5 killed in shaft collapse. I read it twice, even though I didn't need to. I was there that day. I spend some days reliving old memories and moving stuff. However, by the third night, I was unable to fall asleep. So around midnight, I decided to drive out to the old site, maybe for closure, maybe out of guilt. The road was barely passable, cracked asphalt giving way to dirt. Trees had swallowed most of it. When I finally reached the clearing, I almost didn't recognize it. The company had welded steel plates across the mine entrance years ago, and vines had started crawling up the metal. A few old warning signs lay half buried in mud. I stood there for a while, just listening and thinking. It was quiet, peaceful even. No birds, no wind. Then, from deep inside the sealed shaft, I heard something I can't explain. Someone was whistling. As it kept on, I realized I knew the tune. It was an old song my brother and I used to whistle as kids, something our father taught us when we helped him in the garden. A simple little melody, nothing special, but hearing it there, echoing out of the mine where he died, made my knees weak. At first, I tried to convince myself it had to be the wind. Maybe the metal plates were shifting and creating some kind of sound. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The notes were too deliberate and too human. I called out his name before I realized what I was doing. "Danny?" The whistling stopped immediately. I waited. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The silence stretched until I thought I might have imagined it. Then, faintly, from behind the steel, came the sound of someone breathing. Slow, ragged breaths. I stumbled back a few steps. There was no way anyone could be inside. The entrance had been sealed for decades. Still, I found myself stepping closer again, pressing my ear against the cold metal. For a moment, all I could hear was that shallow breathing. Then something hit the other side of the steel, hard. It sounded like a hand. Then another. Then a muffled voice, close enough that I could make out the words. "It ain't right you left me here." I ran. I don't remember getting back to my car or starting the engine. The drive down that dirt road felt endless. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there with the headlights off, trying to find a logical explanation to it, but I couldn't. It had to have been him, or some evil spirit or entity pretending to be him. When I got back to my mother's house, I sat by the window, staring at the tree line behind the house. Every few minutes I thought I saw something move in the dark, shadows between the trees. I was still up at around 3 a.m., and then the sound started again. Whistling. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was the same tune. My brother's tune. I turned off every light in the house and just listened. It moved around the yard from one side to the other. It kept like that for hours until it finally faded away. I sat there until the first light of dawn finally broke through the mist. When morning came, I decided I was done. I packed what little I'd brought, locked the house, and threw my bag in the truck. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed something that made me stop. There were boot prints in the dirt, starting at the tree line, crossing the yard, and stopping right at the porch steps. I didn't get out to look. I just wanted to get out of there and never return. I sold it to a developer a month later. He told me he planned to tear it down and clear the land for cabins. I didn't tell him about the mine or what I heard that night, but part of me wonders if I should have. Part of me wants to go back. Because what if it really is my brother's spirit and he is trapped there somehow? I grew up in a small Appalachian town that most people only ever drive through. There's not much out here, just a gas station, a diner, and miles of woods and winding back roads. You get used to the quiet after a while, but there's something about the mountains that never really lets you relax. Even as a kid, I always felt like something was watching me in the woods. When I got older, hiking became my thing since there weren't much else to do around here. I liked that there were no other people, no noise, just me and the trees and nature. By last year, I'd covered just about every local trail, so when an older guy at the general store mentioned an old ridge path that wasn't used a lot anymore, I was curious. But when I asked for directions, he got quiet and said, "If you see the ridge lights, don't go toward them. They'll lead you off trail." He said it with this dead serious look, like he wasn't joking. I just thought he was messing with me. Small towns are full of stories like that. Folklore that gets told so often people start believing it. I figured it'd just make for a cool hike. So the following Friday, I packed my usual gear, a tent, a flashlight, a small camp stove, and my rifle. I parked off the old service road where the trail supposedly started and began hiking up. It was maybe 40 degrees, and I could smell rain somewhere in the distance. The trail itself wasn't bad. It was slightly overgrown in some parts, but still manageable. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was starting to set, and I could see the entire valley below glowing orange. I set up camp on a small flat spot not far from the tree line. Once I got the fire going, I cooked, ate, and relaxed. I checked my phone. No service, but I expected that. It's quite normal in these parts of the country. Later, around 10:30, I noticed movement out past the firelight. When I looked closer, I saw a faint light. My first thought was another camper, but who would be out walking at this time? It swayed gently, side to side. Then another light appeared beside it, and another slightly behind. 3 in total. They looked like lanterns being carried by people walking in a line. I called out, "Hey, you guys camping out here too?" But there was no response. The lights didn't even change direction. They just kept moving slowly, drifting through the trees. I stood up watching them, thinking maybe they couldn't hear me. But when I took a step toward them, they stopped moving. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, waiting, but nothing happened. I backed up toward my fire, and that's when they started moving again. Same slow sway. I took another step forward. They stopped again. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but it was like they were aware of me, reacting to what I did. My first thought was someone was messing with me, maybe locals trying to scare off hikers. I even grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward them, but the beam didn't reach far enough. The lights didn't reflect like a flashlight or headlamp would. They just glowed. I called out again, "I can see you guys, you're not funny." But I didn't get a response. The lights just kept that slow, steady motion until, all at once, they began to rise, lifting upward, higher and higher, until they hovered above the ridgeline. I watched as they hung there for what felt like forever. Then, one by one, they blinked out. I sat by the fire until it burned low, not sure of what I had just witnessed. After some time, I gathered my thoughts. I walked over to the spot where I'd seen the lights. There were no signs that anyone had been there. Out of nowhere, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around instantly, but no one was there. I'd had enough. Starting to feel uneasy, I decided to walk back to my camp. As I was walking, I looked back toward the trees where I'd just been, and as I looked, I heard someone saying, "You shouldn't be here." It was very low. I barely heard it. But it was there. I began to walk faster. I just wanted to reach my tent so I could feel safe. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard movement outside my tent, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, the woods looked completely normal. Birds were back, the sun was out, and for a second I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed something strange. The ashes from my fire pit were scattered, like someone had kicked through them during the night. There were also faint impressions in the dirt near my tent. Not full footprints, just patches of disturbed soil. I packed up fast and started heading down. About halfway back, I ran into a park ranger's truck parked near the lower trail access. The ranger, an older guy with a beard and sunburned face, waved me down and asked where I'd been hiking. I told him I'd camped up by the ridge, and his whole expression changed. He asked, "You went up there last night?" I nodded. He sighed and said, "That area's closed." "Been closed for years. You didn't see the signs?" I told him there weren't any, just a worn-down path. I mentioned the lights, thinking maybe he'd tell me it was from other campers or some kind of equipment, but he didn't. He just looked at me for a long second and said, "Those aren't people. You should stick to the marked trails." I didn't press him for any details. I just kept walking until I reached my car. I haven't been back since. Locals still talk about the ridge lights sometimes, usually as a warning, sometimes as a story to scare tourists. But no one ever says what they are. And I've stopped trying to figure it out. When my great-uncle passed, I inherited his house up on Cutler Ridge. It was a slanted old farmhouse tucked between the trees near the top of the mountain. I'd never met him, not once, and judging by how my mother talked about him, I hadn't missed much. He was the kind of man who kept to himself, she said, the kind who didn't come down to town unless it was absolutely necessary. Still, I couldn't just let the place rot. I'd been struggling to make ends meet, and the idea of owning a house, and even an old one, was too tempting to ignore. So one weekend, I drove out there to see what I'd gotten myself into. The drive up Cutler Ridge Road was brutal. It was one of those single-lane dirt tracks that seemed to go on forever. Every turn looked the same, trees pressing in on both sides. When I finally reached the top, the house stood alone, its paint peeled to bare wood, the windows clouded over from dust and time. It was eerie, but not in a haunted house kind of way. I was unpacking when an old man from down the road showed up. He introduced himself as Mr. Parson and said he'd been my uncle's neighbor for more than 30 years. He didn't come any closer than the fence, just leaned on it and talked like he was trying to decide if I was worth the trouble. "You're staying up here tonight?" he asked. "Yeah. Figured I'd clean the place up a bit, see what I'm dealing with." He frowned. "You best head back before sundown. Folks around here know better than to keep lights on up there after dark." I almost laughed, thinking he was joking. "Why's that?" He looked over my shoulder at the house. "Ain't my story to tell. But if you got any sense, you'll listen." Then he tipped his hat and walked off. I attributed it to small-town superstition. Maybe kids broke in sometimes, or maybe it was one of those local ghost stories people told for fun. Either way, I wasn't going to drive 2 hours back home after just getting there, although I will admit, it made me nervous. The house itself was stuck in another era. Old wallpaper, dusty furniture, a radio that probably hadn't worked since the 60s. Most of the photos on the walls were black and white. My great-uncle looked grim in all of them, never smiling. As night approached, I made some canned soup on a camping stove and set up my sleeping bag in the upstairs bedroom. The sun went down faster than I expected, and before long, the woods outside were swallowed in total black. I turned on a lamp beside the bed and started reading through some of the old letters I'd found in a drawer. That's when I heard the first knock. 3 short knocks. They came from inside the room. I lay there motionless, my eyes darting to the door. I hadn't locked it, but I was the only one in the house. I told myself the sound must have come from the wood settling, or maybe an animal was in the walls. It was, after all, a really old house. Still, I felt uneasy. I continued looking through the old letters, but then it came again. 3 knocks. I didn't say a word. I sat up, waiting for something else to happen. After a full minute of silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and open the door. There was nothing. The hallway was empty. I checked the other rooms upstairs. All were empty. When I came back to the bedroom, the lamp was flickering a bit. I turned it off and sat in the dark for a while, trying to convince myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old man and his warning. Around midnight, I was in bed reading a book when I heard footsteps coming from downstairs. I leaned over to grab my phone, but the screen stayed black. Dead battery, I'd forgotten to charge it. I cursed under my breath and listened. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Then, the faintest creak, 1 step at a time, started coming up. I sat there completely still. I felt paralyzed. Someone was in the house with me. The steps continued, and when the sound reached the top landing, I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked open the bedroom door and aimed my flashlight toward the stairs. It was completely empty. I waited in the doorway, shaking with fear. Everything was quiet. Then I noticed something near the far end of the hall. A door that I was certain had been open earlier was now shut. It was my great-uncle's study. I walked toward it. The floorboards were groaning under my weight. When I got close enough to touch the handle, I noticed a faint humming sound coming from inside. No one should be here. I was supposed to be the only human for miles. I opened the door slowly. The room was empty and dark. The little light there was came from the moonlight shining through the window. I noticed something on the desk. In the middle of a pile of old papers sat a glass lantern, one I hadn't seen before. I swear just as I looked at it, it tipped over and hit the ground, causing it to shatter. I stepped back, and just as I did, the door in front of me shut with force. I ran back to my room and spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the first sign of daylight. I kept hearing footsteps throughout the night. At one point, they stopped just outside my door, but nothing came of it. When morning came, I packed everything I'd brought and loaded it into the car. I moved out that morning and sold the property a few weeks later. The buyer was a man from out of state who said he wanted a place to get away from everything. I didn't warn him. I didn't say a word about what happened.